In 1066, one man stood between England and invasion. He was not a king by blood. He was not chosen by God or by birthright. He was chosen by desperate men in a desperate moment, and handed the most dangerous crown in the world. Harold Godwinson had already fought one impossible battle in the north of England, marched his exhausted army hundreds of miles south, and walked straight into the most consequential military engagement in the history of the English-speaking world, the Battle of Hastings. October 14th, 1066, the day England died and was reborn as something entirely different. This is the story of the last Anglo-Saxon king, the man who held England for 9 months and lost it in a single afternoon.
Harold Godwinson was born around 1022 into one of the most powerful noble families in Anglo-Saxon England. His father, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was the most influential man in England outside of the king himself, a political operator of extraordinary skill who had built his family's power through decades of careful maneuvering, strategic marriages, and an instinct for survival that bordered on ruthless. Harold grew up watching his father work the corridors of power with the precision of a chess grandmaster. He learned everything, and when Godwin died in 1053, Harold inherited not just the earldom of Wessex but the entire weight of his father's ambition and the enemies that came with it. England in the mid-11th century was not a peaceful kingdom. It was a prize that multiple powerful men across Europe believed was rightfully theirs, and the Anglo-Saxon system of choosing kings, where the Wittenagement, a council of nobles and clergy, selected the monarch, meant that the crown was never truly secure on any man's head. Harold understood this better than anyone. He spent the years following his father's death consolidating power, expanding his influence, and positioning himself as the indispensable man in English politics, the one figure without whom the kingdom simply could not function. By the early 1060s, he was effectively running England while the aging and childless King Edward the Confessor grew increasingly frail and detached from the business of governing. Then came the oath. Around 1064, Harold sailed to Normandy. The exact circumstances remain disputed by historians to this day, and found himself in the court of Duke William of Normandy. What happened next became the central controversy of the entire Norman conquest. William claimed that Harold swore a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne after Edward's death. Harold's position, to the extent that we can reconstruct it, was that any oath extracted under duress or under false pretenses carried no moral or legal weight. Whether the oath was genuine, coerced, or fabricated entirely by Norman propaganda is a question that has occupied historians for nearly 1,000 years. What is certain is that William believed, or chose to believe, that Harold had betrayed him. And that belief would bring an army across the English Channel. Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066. The following day, the Wittenagement chose Harold Godwinson as King of England. He was crowned immediately, with an urgency that tells you everything about how dangerous everyone knew the situation to be. The crown had barely settled on his head when the threats began arriving from every direction simultaneously. Harald Hardrada of Norway, one of the most ferocious warriors alive, was claiming the English throne. William of Normandy was preparing an invasion fleet on the other side of the Channel. And within England itself, Harold's own brother Tostig, bitter, exiled, and consumed by resentment, was raiding the northern coastline and had allied himself with Hardrada. Harold Godwinson became King of England on January 6, 1066. He inherited a kingdom already at war from the moment the crown touched his head. The turning point of Harold Godwinson's story is not one moment. It is a sequence of decisions made under impossible pressure, in impossible circumstances, by a man who had no good options, only a series of terrible ones and the judgment to choose the least catastrophic among them. And for a few extraordinary weeks in the autumn of 1066, that judgment was nothing short of military genius. Then it ran out. September 1066. Harold Hardrada of Norway landed in the north of England with an army of approximately 10,000 men, one of the largest invasion forces England had ever faced. He was accompanied by Harold's own brother Tostig, whose betrayal added a personal dimension of pain to what was already a military catastrophe. The north of England was being burned. York had fallen. The situation was desperate. Harold Godwinson gathered his household troops, called up his forces, and marched north from London at a speed that military historians still cite as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the medieval period. He covered nearly 200 miles in 4 days. His men were exhausted, their feet bleeding, their bodies running on nothing but the momentum of a king who refused to slow down. On September 25, 1066, Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire and launched a surprise attack on Hardrada's forces. What followed was one of the most decisive and complete military victories in English history. Hardrada was killed, Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army, which had arrived in 300 ships, was so completely destroyed that the survivors needed fewer than 25 ships to carry them home. It was a stunning, total, almost unbelievable victory. Harold Godwinson had just defeated one of the greatest warriors in the world in a surprise engagement after a forced march of 200 miles. He was, in that moment, arguably the most formidable military commander in Europe. Then the messenger arrived from the south. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey Bay on September 28, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge. The channel winds that had kept William's fleet pinned in Normandy for weeks had finally shifted, and he had crossed. He was in England. He was burning villages along the Sussex coast to draw Harold south and force a confrontation. Harold faced a decision that has been debated by military historians ever since. His army was exhausted from Stamford Bridge and the march north. His forces needed rest, resupply, and reinforcement. Every experienced military advisor around him counseled waiting, gathering more troops, resting the existing ones, letting William's army exhaust itself foraging in unfamiliar territory through an English autumn. Harold did not wait. Whether from confidence, from fury at what William was doing to English villages, or from a warrior's instinct that momentum was everything and hesitation was death, he turned his exhausted army around and marched them south immediately. 200 miles north, 200 miles south, in under 3 weeks. On October 13, Harold's army arrived at a ridge near Hastings and took up their defensive position. They had marched over 400 miles in less than a month. They were about to fight the battle that would decide the fate of England forever. October 14, 1066. The Battle of Hastings lasted approximately 9 hours, an extraordinarily long engagement for medieval warfare, where most battles were decided in minutes. Harold's army held their ridge position with remarkable discipline through wave after wave of Norman cavalry charges and arrow volleys. For most of the day, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall held. There were moments when William's army came close to breaking entirely. There were moments when the battle could have gone the other way. And then, sometime in the late afternoon, the exact circumstances disputed by every chronicle written about that day, Harold Godwinson fell. An arrow through the eye, according to the Bayeux Tapestry, though historians debate even this. What is not disputed is that once Harold fell, the Anglo-Saxon resistance collapsed almost immediately. The shield wall broke. The feared scattered into the darkening English countryside, and William of Normandy rode toward a crown that would change England forever. Harold Godwinson reigned for 9 months and 9 days. In the entire sweep of English royal history, few reigns were shorter. And yet the weight of what ended with his death at Hastings is almost impossible to overstate. With Harold died the Anglo-Saxon world. The England that existed on October 13, 1066, its language, its aristocracy, its culture, its entire governing class, was gone within a generation. The Normans replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility almost completely. The English language itself was transformed beyond recognition, absorbing thousands of French words that remain in daily use today. The architecture changed, the legal system changed, the relationship between the English crown and the church changed. Everything changed. And it all changed because one exhausted king made one decision not to wait on a ridge in Sussex on an autumn morning in 1066. But Harold's legacy is more complicated and more interesting than simple defeat. He has been rehabilitated by historians in recent decades as one of the most capable and underrated rulers England ever produced. His military achievement at Stamford Bridge was genuinely extraordinary. A forced march of 200 miles followed by a complete destruction of a major invasion force is the kind of campaign that earns commanders immortality in the history books. His political management of England in the 9 months of his reign showed sophistication and competence. He was, by any serious historical measure, a formidable king. The tragedy is not that he was inadequate. The tragedy is that he was extraordinary, and that extraordinary was not quite enough against the particular combination of bad timing, exhausted troops, and William's relentless tactical genius on that one October afternoon. In England today, Harold Godwinson occupies a unique and deeply emotional place in the national memory. He is the last of something. The final representative of an older England, rougher, perhaps, more Viking than French, less hierarchical and more communal than the feudal system William imposed. That many English people look back on with a complicated mixture of pride and mourning. There are statues of him, streets named after him, a persistent legend, almost certainly false but emotionally irresistible, that he survived Hastings and lived out his days as a hermit. The English do not quite want to let him go, because letting Harold go means accepting completely what was lost on that ridge in Sussex. And nearly 1,000 years later, that loss still feels, in some quiet and irrational corner of the English imagination, like something that should not have happened. Like a story that deserved a different ending.